Millionaire sees cleaning lady's daughter reading book to calm twins who couldn't sleep. Days later, something devastating happened. Before we jump in, this story reached people in over 50 countries last week. Let's see how far it goes today. The autumn rain drummed against the mansion's windows as Richard Sterling paced his home office, trying to focus on quarterly reports that seemed meaningless since Sarah's death. 2 years had passed, yet the silence in his house still felt deafening. His 6-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, barely spoke anymore, and when they did, it was usually to ask when Mommy was coming home. Richard rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at his watch. 3:30. Carol, their housekeeper, would be finishing up soon. She'd been a godsend these past 12 months, quietly managing their chaos with a gentleness that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Unlike the previous housekeepers who'd quit after dealing with the children's tantrums, Carol somehow understood their grief. A commotion upstairs caught his attention. Not the usual crashes or screaming, but something else, voices. Richard frowned and climbed the marble staircase, following the sound to the twins' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he saw something that stopped him cold. A teenage girl sat cross-legged on Emma's bed, holding a worn copy of Charlotte's Web. Emma and Ethan flanked her on either side, completely still, their tear-stained faces fixed on the girl's lips as she read with animated expressions. "Some pig," the girl read, her voice full of wonder. "Humble. Radiant." These were the words that appeared in Charlotte's Web, and everyone called them a miracle. Richard's breath caught. He hadn't seen his children this calm in 2 years. Emma's thumb wasn't in her mouth for once, and Ethan's hands weren't clenched into angry fists. They looked peaceful. "But Charlotte knew the truth," the girl continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She knew that real miracles don't come from magic words in spider webs. They come from friendship, from caring about someone so much that you'd do anything to save them." Emma leaned closer. "Like Mommy did for us?" Richard's heart clenched. The girl's eyes softened with understanding far beyond her years. "Exactly like that, sweetheart. Your Mommy's love is still here, in your heart. It's the strongest magic there is." Through the crack in the door, Richard watched his daughter's face transform. For the first time since the funeral, Emma smiled. Who was this girl? And how had she accomplished in minutes what child psychologists hadn't managed in months? As if sensing his presence, the girl looked up. Their eyes met through the doorway, and Richard saw intelligence, compassion, and something else he couldn't name. She didn't look startled or embarrassed at being caught. Instead, she simply nodded once and returned to the story. Richard backed away quietly, his mind racing. He'd never seen this girl before, yet she was clearly comfortable in his home. Was she related to Carol somehow? 20 minutes later, he heard soft footsteps on the stairs and the gentle closing of the front door. From his office window, he watched Carol walking down the driveway with the mysterious girl. Even from this distance, he could see the family resemblance. The same graceful walk, the same way of tilting their heads when listening. Carol's daughter then. But why hadn't she mentioned her before? Richard glanced back toward the stairs. For the first time in months, he couldn't hear any crying from the twins' room. No demands for water, no complaints about monsters under the bed, just blissful, healing silence. Whatever that girl had done, Richard knew one thing for certain. He needed to find out more about her, because if she could bring peace to his broken children, maybe she could help them find their way back to joy. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything look golden and new. Richard smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. Perhaps there was hope after all. Margaret Maggie Thompson kicked a pebble along the sidewalk as she walked home from Riverside High, her backpack heavy with textbooks and dreams that seemed equally weighty. At 16, She'd learned that dreams required more than hope. They needed money, opportunity, and luck she wasn't sure she possessed. "How'd it go today, baby?" Carol asked as they walked together away from the Sterling mansion. "The twins fell asleep before I finished the chapter," Maggie replied, adjusting her worn messenger bag. "Mr. Sterling was watching from the hallway again." Carol's steps faltered. "He was? Did he seem angry?" "No, Mum, more like surprised, maybe even grateful." Maggie glanced at her mother's worried expression. "You really think he minds me coming with you?" "Rich people don't like disruptions to their routines, Maggie. Mr. Sterling's been through enough without us adding complications." Maggie nodded, though she disagreed. In the few weeks she'd been visiting the mansion after school, she'd seen how Richard Sterling looked at his children, with a love so fierce it was almost painful to witness, mixed with a helplessness that broke her heart. The man wasn't cold or demanding like her mother feared. He was drowning in grief and didn't know how to save his kids from drowning too. They turned onto Maple Street, where their small rental house sat between an auto repair shop and a laundromat. The contrast with the Sterling mansion couldn't have been starker, but Maggie had stopped feeling embarrassed about their circumstances long ago. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, and Maggie had been contributing with babysitting and tutoring since she was 14. "Speaking of routines," Carol said carefully, "I've been thinking, maybe you should focus on your own schoolwork instead of coming with me, or say prep." "Mom, we've talked about this. The prep course costs $800 we don't have. Besides, I like helping with Emma and Ethan. They remind me of myself when I was little." Carol stopped walking. "What do you mean?" Maggie chose her words carefully. Her mother already carried enough guilt about their father leaving when Maggie was 8. She didn't need to know how many nights 6-year-old Maggie had cried herself to sleep, wondering what she'd done wrong. Just that they're trying to make sense of loss. Sometimes kids need someone who speaks their language. They reached their front door, painted a cheerful yellow that was starting to peel. Carol fumbled with her keys, and Maggie noticed her mother's hands trembling slightly. "Mom, you okay?" "Just tired, honey. Mrs. Patterson wants me to come in early tomorrow to prepare for her dinner party, and the diner needs me for the lunch rush." Maggie felt the familiar knot in her stomach. 3 jobs meant 3 chances for exhaustion to lead to mistakes, and mistakes meant lost income they couldn't afford. Inside their small living room, bills were stacked neatly on the coffee table. Maggie glimpsed the electric company logo on top and felt her chest tighten. Past due. Again. "I could pick up more tutoring hours," she offered. "Absolutely not. Your grades are your ticket out of here, Maggie. Promise me you won't sacrifice your education for anything." Maggie nodded, but privately disagreed. What good were perfect grades if they couldn't afford to keep the lights on? What good was a college application if she couldn't pay the fees to submit it? That evening, as she worked on calculus homework at their tiny kitchen table, Maggie's mind wandered to Emma and Ethan. Tomorrow after school, she'd return to the mansion and read them another chapter. Maybe Bridge to Terabithia this time, or something lighter like The Phantom Toll Booth. She thought about Richard Sterling's face in the hallway, the way he'd looked at her with something like wonder. In that moment, she'd seen past his expensive suit and intimidating reputation to the broken father underneath. Maggie understood that feeling. She'd been caring for her mother's emotional wounds for years, just like she was trying to care for the twins. Sometimes being strong meant finding quiet ways to heal the people you loved. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Jessica. "Movie tonight? Tyler's driving." Maggie looked at the bills on the coffee table, then at her mother asleep in her chair, still wearing her Sterling mansion uniform. "Can't tonight. Studying?" she texted back. But as she returned to her calculus, Maggie allowed herself one small dream. Someday she'd have enough money to take care of her mother the way Carol had always taken care of her. Someday families like the Sterlings wouldn't seem like they lived on a different planet. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to help Emma and Ethan remember how to smile, really smile again. The number of days since their mother's death, 748. Maggie knew because Emma had started counting aloud during their reading sessions, as if keeping track could somehow bring Sarah back. Tomorrow would be day 749, and Maggie would be there to help them through it. Richard stood in his study, staring at the business card in his hand. Princeton Early Admission Committee. He'd called them that morning on a whim, asking about academic scholarships for exceptional students. The conversation had been enlightening in ways he hadn't expected. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," the admissions officer had said, "we do have several full-ride scholarships for students with exceptional academic records and demonstrated financial need. The deadline for applications is December 15th. 6 weeks away." Richard glanced toward the ceiling, where he could hear Maggie's voice reading to the twins. She'd been coming with Carol for 3 weeks now, and the transformation in Emma and Ethan was nothing short of miraculous. They ate dinner without tantrums, went to bed without fights, and yesterday Ethan had actually laughed at one of Maggie's character voices. But it wasn't just the children who were changing. Richard found himself looking forward to those brief glimpses of Maggie in the hallway, the sound of her voice bringing life back into his home. There was something about her presence that made the mansion feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where healing might be possible. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Sterling." Carol's voice was hesitant. "Come in, Carol." She entered, carrying fresh linens, her movements careful and precise as always. "I wanted to apologize for bringing Maggie along these past few weeks. I know it's not professional, but my neighbor, who usually watches her after school—" "Carol." Richard raised a hand. "You don't need to apologize. Maggie is welcome here." Surprise flickered across Carol's face. "She is. She's been wonderful with the children. I've never seen them so calm." Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell me about her. She seems remarkably mature for her age." Carol's expression shifted, pride mixing with worry. "Maggie's always been special. She's been on the honor roll since elementary school, takes advanced placement classes, volunteers at the Children's Hospital on weekends. She wants to study pediatric psychology in college." "That's impressive. Where is she planning to apply?" "Community college first, then hopefully transfer to the state university. It's all we can afford." Richard felt something twist in his chest. He thought of his own college experience at Harvard, paid for without a second thought. He thought of Sarah's master's degree from Stanford, funded by her trust fund. The idea that someone like Maggie, brilliant, compassionate, capable, might be limited by finances felt wrong on a fundamental level. "She could aim higher," he said carefully. Carol's shoulders stiffened slightly. "We're grateful for any education she can get, Mr. Sterling. Not everyone can afford the luxury of choices." There was no bitterness in her voice, just matter-of-fact acceptance that stung worse than accusation would have. Richard realized he'd stumbled into territory that required delicacy. "Of course, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." After Carol left, Richard sat alone with his thoughts. Through the window, he watched Maggie walking down the driveway with her mother, their heads bent together in conversation. Even from this distance, he could see the easy affection between them, the way Maggie shortened her stride to match Carol's tired steps. That evening, Richard found himself in the twins' room, something he'd avoided since Sarah's death. Emma's bed still had the book Maggie had been reading, The Secret Garden, marked with a makeshift bookmark made from a homework assignment. The assignment was calculus, he noticed, far beyond what most high school students attempted. "Daddy?" Emma's sleepy voice came from behind him. Richard turned to find both twins in the doorway, ready for bed. "Hey, sweetheart. Just checking on you." Is Maggie coming tomorrow? Ethan asked, clutching his stuffed elephant. I believe so. Do you like when she reads to you? Emma nodded solemnly. She does the voices different for each person, and she explains the hard words without making us feel dumb. She says books are like magic windows, Ethan added. You can look through them and see other worlds. Richard felt his throat tighten. These were the longest conversations he'd had with his children in months. She sounds very wise. She is, Emma said matter-of-factly. She's going to be a doctor for kids' feelings someday. She told us. After tucking them in, another small miracle, as they usually fought bedtime tooth and nail, Richard returned to his study. He pulled out his laptop and began researching scholarship programs, admission requirements, and application deadlines. If Maggie Thompson wanted to become a pediatric psychologist, Richard Sterling was going to make sure she had every opportunity to succeed. He owed her that much for giving him back his children's laughter. But as he scrolled through Princeton's requirements, a thought nagged at him. How could he help without patronizing Carol or making Maggie feel like charity? The woman had too much pride to accept direct assistance, and her daughter seemed to have inherited that same stubborn independence. Richard leaned back in his chair, formulating a plan. Sometimes the best way to help someone was to make them think they were helping themselves. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. Princeton Alumni Association. Yes, this is Richard Sterling, class of '93. I'd like to endow an anonymous scholarship. The November air carried the scent of burning leaves as Maggie balanced 3 library books and her physics homework while walking up the Sterling Mansion's driveway. She'd been coming here for 6 weeks now, and the routine had become as natural as breathing. School, mansion, home, homework, sleep, repeat. But today felt different. Carol had been quiet during their walk from the bus stop, and when Maggie asked about it, her mother had just shaken her head and said, "Nothing that won't work itself out, baby." Maggie knew that phrase. It meant money troubles were worse than usual. Inside the mansion, she found Emma and Ethan in the living room, building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and throw blankets. They looked up with matching grins when she entered. "Maggie!" Emma launched herself into a hug. "We made a reading castle." "I can see that. Very architectural." Maggie admired their handiwork, noting how they'd created a cozy space just big enough for 3 people. "What are we reading today?" "The one about the girl who finds the garden," Ethan said, diving into the fort. "The secret garden." "Good choice." As they settled in with the book, Maggie became aware of a presence nearby. Richard Sterling was in the adjacent hallway, not quite hiding but not quite visible either. This had become part of their routine too, him listening from the shadows while she read to his children. Mary had liked to think of it as her own, and that she had found it herself, Maggie read, but now she knew that Colin had as much right to it as herself. Why didn't Mary want to share? Emma asked. Well, she'd never had anything that was really hers before. Sometimes when we've been lonely for a long time, it's scary to let other people into the special places in our hearts. From the hallway came the soft sound of retreating footsteps. Maggie wondered if Richard Sterling understood that the stories were as much for him as they were for his children. After the reading session, Maggie helped Carol tidy the kitchen while the twins played upstairs. The house felt different today. Lighter somehow, as if winter was finally loosening its grip on the Sterling family. "Mum," Maggie said carefully, "what did you mean earlier about things working out?" Carol's hands stilled on the dish towel. "Maggie, I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens, you keep your grades up. You keep applying for scholarships. Your future is more important than our present troubles." Fear crawled up Maggie's spine. "How bad is it?" "We might have to move. The rent's going up, and with winter coming, heating bills." Carol's voice trailed off. "What about your job here and at the diner?" "I'll figure something out." Maybe find a live-in position somewhere else. The thought of leaving made Maggie's chest tight, not just because of their home, but because of Emma and Ethan. Who would read to them? Who would understand that Ethan needed the elephant voice to be slightly gruff but not scary, or that Emma always needed an extra hug during sad parts? There has to be another way. Honey, we've talked about this. Sometimes life doesn't give us choices. But as they walked home that evening, Maggie's mind churned with possibilities. She thought about the SAT prep course she couldn't afford, the college application fees that seemed impossible, the growing stack of bills on their coffee table. She thought about Emma's shy smile and Ethan's growing confidence, and how Richard Sterling had started nodding to her in the hallways instead of just watching from the shadows. That night, she stayed up late researching scholarship opportunities, writing application essays, and calculating the exact cost of her mother's monthly expenses. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible. She just needed more time. Time, and maybe a miracle. As she finally closed her laptop, Maggie caught her reflection in the dark window. 16 years old, she looked older. The girl staring back at her had her mother's determined chin and her father's stubborn eyes. But there was something else there too, a quiet strength that belonged entirely to her. Tomorrow, she would read to Emma and Ethan again. She would continue being the bridge between their grief and their healing. And somehow, she would find a way to save her family from falling apart, because if books had taught her anything, it was that the most powerful magic came from refusing to give up hope, even when the whole world seemed determined to prove that hope was foolish. Especially then. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Richard was reviewing acquisition reports. Carol's voice was strained when she called to say she wouldn't be able to come in that day. "Is everything all right?" Richard asked, though he could tell from her tone that it wasn't. "Maggie's in the hospital. She collapsed at school during her physics exam." The reports scattered to the floor as Richard stood. "What happened? Is she okay?" "They're running tests. The doctor thinks it might be exhaustion, but they want to keep her overnight for observation." Carol's voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry to leave you without notice, Mr. Sterling. I know it's unprofessional." "Carol, stop. Take care of your daughter. That's all that matters." After hanging up, Richard stared out his office window at the grey November sky. The house felt hollow without Carol's quiet efficiency and Maggie's laughter echoing from the twins' room. Speaking of which, he realized he hadn't heard Emma and Ethan at all this morning. He found them in the living room, sitting silently on the couch. No games, no chatter, no requests for snacks or attention. They looked like they had in the first months after Sarah's death, lost and small. "Hey guys, what are you up to?" "Where's Maggie?" Emma asked, her thumb creeping toward her mouth for the first time in weeks. Richard sat beside them, choosing his words carefully. "She's not feeling well today, so she's resting at the doctor's office." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "Is she going to die like Mommy?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Of course, that's where their minds would go. In their experience, people who went to doctors didn't always come home. "No, buddy. She's just tired. She'll be better soon." But even as he said it, Richard felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. 16-year-old girls didn't collapse from exhaustion unless something was seriously wrong. Either medically or... He thought about Carol's 3 jobs, the way Maggie always looked tired despite her bright smile, how she'd mentioned tutoring other students for extra money. Was she working herself to death trying to help support her family? That afternoon, Richard called his personal physician, Dr. Harrison, who had privileges at Riverside General. "Richard, good to hear from you. How are Emma and Ethan adjusting?" "They're better, actually. Much better. But I'm calling about a friend's daughter. Margaret Thompson, 16, admitted today for exhaustion. Can you tell me anything?" There was a pause. I can't share specific medical information, but if you're asking as someone who cares about her well-being, I can tell you she's stable. However, the preliminary tests show signs of chronic stress and malnutrition, not severe, but concerning for someone her age. Malnutrition, the word hit Richard like a slap. While he lived in a mansion and worried about stock portfolios, Maggie Thompson had been slowly starving herself to help her mother make ends meet. After the call, Richard sat in his study, staring at Sarah's photograph on his desk. She smiled back at him, radiant and confident, the way she'd looked on their wedding day. What would she think of him now, sitting in his ivory tower while the girl who'd saved their children's hearts was in the hospital because she couldn't afford to eat properly? "Dad?" Emma's voice came from the doorway. He turned to find both twins watching him with worried expressions. "Can we visit Maggie?" Ethan asked. "I don't think they allow children in the hospital, buddy." "We could make her a card," Emma suggested, "with pictures. She likes pictures in books." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I think she'd love that." As he watched his children work on a get-well card with fierce concentration, their small hands carefully coloring flowers and rainbows, Richard made a decision. He'd been passive long enough, watching from the sidelines while life happened around him. It was time to stop watching and start acting. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. "James, it's Richard. I need you to set up a charitable foundation. Anonymous donations, educational focus. How quickly can you have the paperwork ready?" "Depends on how complex you want it. Basic structure? 2 days." "Perfect. And James, I need you to look into the application process for academic scholarships. Specifically, how someone might go about funding a full scholarship to Princeton. Richard, this is quite a departure for you. What's brought this on?" Richard looked at Emma carefully drawing a portrait of Maggie reading a book, her tongue poking out in concentration. "I owe someone a debt I can never repay," he said. "But I can try." As evening fell, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. He prayed, not to any particular god, but to the universe itself, asking for the chance to give back just a fraction of what Maggie Thompson had given his family. Tomorrow, he would visit the hospital. Tonight, he would plan how to save the girl who had saved his children, because some debts were worth everything you had to give. The fluorescent lights in Riverside General's waiting room buzzed with an irritating persistence as Richard sat with a bouquet of sunflowers and the twins' handmade card. He'd been there for an hour, working up the courage to approach Carol Thompson, who sat rigidly in a plastic chair near the elevator. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Her uniform from the diner was wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a paper coffee cup. "Carol?" Richard stood slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Mr. Sterling, what are you doing here?" "Emma and Ethan wanted Maggie to have these." He offered the flowers and card. "How is she?" Carol's composure cracked slightly. "Better. The doctor says she can go home tomorrow if her blood work improves." She took the gifts with shaking hands. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, I did." Richard sat in the chair beside her, noting how she tensed at his proximity. "Carol, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Is Maggie working too much?" A defensive wall went up behind Carol's eyes. "Maggie's a good student. She knows her priorities." "That's not what I asked." They sat in silence for a moment, the hospital's evening routine continuing around them. Finally, Carol's shoulders sagged. "She tutors 3 kids after school and babysits on weekends. She said it was just to save for college, but—" Carol's voice broke. "The doctor asked about her eating habits. Apparently she's been skipping lunch to save money and giving her breakfast to me because she thought I looked tired." Richard felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "She's been starving herself." "Not starving, just making sacrifices." Carol's pride warred with her worry. "We don't take charity, Mr. Sterling. We never have." "This isn't about charity. It's about Emma and Ethan." Carol looked confused. "What do you mean?" Richard chose his words carefully, knowing this conversation would determine everything that came next. "Your daughter saved my children. For months after Sarah died, they were unreachable. Therapists, counselors, medications. Nothing worked. They were disappearing into their grief, and I was helpless to stop it." He paused, remembering those dark days. Then Maggie started reading to them, and suddenly they were laughing again, sleeping through the night, talking about the future. She just read them stories. She gave them hope. She reminded them that it was safe to care about someone again. Richard turned to face Carol directly. "Do you know what that's worth to a parent? Do you know what I would pay to have my children back?" Carol's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Sterling, I have a proposition for you. Not charity, an arrangement that benefits both our families." Before Carol could object, Richard continued quickly. "The twins need stability. They need someone who understands them, who can help them continue healing. Maggie has a gift for that. I'd like to hire her as their official tutor and companion, 20 hours a week, $15 an hour." Carol's mouth fell open. $300 a week? That's more than I make at the diner. And it would still be far less than what she's worth to my family." Richard leaned forward. "But there would be conditions. She maintains her grade point average. She applies to the colleges of her choice. And she stops sacrificing her health for money." "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" Richard thought of Sarah, of the life they'd planned for their children, of the future that had been stolen by cancer and grief. Then he thought of Maggie's voice in the darkness, reading stories that brought light back to his world. Because some debts can only be repaid by passing kindness forward. Carol was quiet for a long moment, studying his face for hidden motives or conditions. Finally, she said, "I'd need to talk to Maggie. She's proud like her father was. She might not accept it. Then we'll convince her it's not charity. We'll make her understand that she's not taking from us. She's giving us exactly what we need." And as if summoned by their conversation, a nurse appeared. "Mrs. Thompson, Maggie's asking for you." Carol stood, clutching the flowers and card. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for caring enough to come here. Thank your daughter. She taught my family how to care again." Watching Carol disappear into the elevator, Richard felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was moving forward instead of just surviving. He was building something instead of just protecting what remained. Tomorrow, when Maggie was released from the hospital, everything would change. Not just for her and Carol, but for Emma and Ethan too. They would all heal together or not at all. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Richard Sterling believed in tomorrow. And that, he thought as he walked back to his car, was worth everything. Maggie stared at the formal contract Richard Sterling had placed on the coffee table of their small living room. $300 a week for reading to Emma and Ethan, helping with homework, and being what the document called a child development companion. "It's too much," she said quietly. She said. "It's exactly what the position requires," Richard replied, his tone businesslike but gentle. "Emma and Ethan have made remarkable progress with you. I need someone who can maintain that momentum while I travel for business." Carol sat beside Maggie on their worn couch, her expression carefully neutral. They discussed this for 2 hours after returning from the hospital, weighing pride against practicality, independence against necessity. "The hours are flexible around your school schedule," Richard continued. "Weekdays after 3, Saturday mornings. If your grades drop below a 3.8, the contract becomes void." Maggie looked up sharply. "You're bribing me to succeed? I'm investing in someone who's already succeeding." Richard's smile was slight but genuine. Your transcripts are impressive, Maggie. Early admission to Princeton isn't impossible if you apply. Princeton? Maggie laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mr. Sterling, people like me don't go to Princeton. No, why not? The simple question hung in the air. Maggie realized she didn't have an answer that wasn't rooted in assumptions about money, class, and belonging. The application fee alone is $85, she said finally. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, Princeton Alumni Association. She's expecting your call. They have a fee waiver program for exceptional students. Maggie took the card with trembling fingers. The Princeton logo seemed to shimmer with possibility and terror in equal measure. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Richard was quiet for a moment, looking around their modest living room with its second-hand furniture and cheerful yellow walls. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Maggie think of her own father's rare moments of vulnerability. "Because 2 years ago, I thought my children were lost forever. You brought them back to me. If you don't understand why that's worth everything I have to give, then you don't understand what it means to be a parent." After he left, Maggie and Carol sat in silence, the contract between them like a bridge they weren't sure they were ready to cross. "What do you think?" Carol asked finally. "I think he's either the kindest man alive, or he's hiding something. Maybe both." That evening, Maggie called Dr. Morgan. The conversation lasted 45 minutes and ended with an invitation to visit campus the following weekend. As she hung up, Maggie caught her reflection in the kitchen window. The girl, looking back, seemed older, more serious, weighted with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. The next morning, she signed the contract. The December snow fell softly as Maggie walked through Princeton's campus, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Dr. Morgan, an elegant woman in her 50s, guided her past Gothic buildings that looked like something from a fairy tale. "The psychology department is one of our strongest," Dr. Morgan explained. "Particularly our developmental and clinical programs. With your interest in pediatric psychology, you'd find excellent mentorship here." Maggie nodded, trying to process the reality of standing here. 6 weeks ago, Princeton had been an impossible dream. Now she was touring labs and meeting professors who spoke about her potential future with casual confidence. "Your transcripts are remarkable," Dr. Morgan continued. "But what really impressed the admissions committee was your personal essay about using storytelling as a therapeutic tool with children." They paused outside the psychology building, where students hurried past with armloads of books and purposeful expressions. Maggie tried to imagine herself among them, belonging to this world of intellectual ambition and endless possibility. "There's something else," Dr. Morgan said carefully. "An anonymous benefactor has established a full scholarship program specifically for students pursuing pediatric psychology. Room, board, tuition, books, everything covered for 4 years." Maggie's knees nearly buckled. "Anonymous?" "Completely. They've requested no recognition, no contact with recipients, just the knowledge that they're investing in future healers." The tour continued, but Maggie's mind reeled. Who would create a scholarship so perfectly aligned with her dreams? And why anonymous? That evening, back at the Sterling mansion, she found Emma and Ethan in their pajamas, waiting with barely contained excitement. "Maggie! Maggie!" Emma launched herself forward. "Daddy said you went to see a castle." "Not quite a castle, sweetie. More like a really big school." "Are you going to leave us?" Ethan's question was quiet, but the fear behind it was enormous. Maggie knelt to his level, taking both children's hands. "If I do go to that school, it won't be until after you graduate from kindergarten. That's still months away, and even then I'll only be a few hours by car." "You could visit." "Promise," Emma demanded. "I promise, but right now I'm here. What should we read tonight?" As they settled into their routine, Maggie became aware of Richard listening from the hallway again. When the children fell asleep, she found him in his study, staring at a photograph of a beautiful woman with Emma's eyes and Ethan's smile. "Your wife?" she asked softly. "Sarah. She would have loved watching you with them." Maggie studied the photograph, noting the easy happiness in Sarah's expression. "She looks kind." She was, and brilliant. She taught literature at the university before the children were born. Richard's voice grew distant. "She always said that stories were the closest thing to magic in the real world, that they could heal hearts and change lives." She was right. Richard looked up at Maggie with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sometimes I wonder if she, somehow, sent you to us. If this is her way of making sure Emma and Ethan remember how to believe in happy endings." The conversation stayed with Maggie as she walked home through the December evening. There had been something in Richard's voice, a note of gratitude so deep it was almost reverential. She thought about the anonymous scholarship, the perfect timing of opportunities, the way everything seemed to be aligning as if guided by an unseen hand. But as she reached her front door, another thought occurred to her. What if Richard Sterling was her anonymous benefactor? What if this elaborate kindness was his way of repaying a debt he felt he owed? The thought should have bothered her, should have triggered her inherited pride and independence. Instead, as she looked back toward the mansion's warm lights in the distance, Maggie felt something unexpected. Hope. Maybe it didn't matter who was orchestrating these miracles. Maybe what mattered was that someone believed in her enough to make them possible. The acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday in February, thick and official, with Princeton's seal embossed on cream paper. Maggie stared at it for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open it. "We are delighted to inform you that you have been accepted into Princeton University's class of 2028. Her hands shook as she read about the full scholarship, the orientation schedule, the dorm assignment. It was real. Princeton was real, and she was going. "Mom!" she called, her voice cracking with emotion. Carol emerged from the kitchen, took one look at Maggie's face, and burst into tears. They held each other in their tiny living room, crying and laughing and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. That afternoon at the Sterling mansion, Maggie found herself unusually nervous. How do you tell 6-year-olds that you're leaving for college when they've already lost so much? She found Emma and Ethan in the living room, building an elaborate Lego castle. They looked up with their usual bright smiles, and Maggie's heart clenched. "I have something to tell you guys," she began carefully. 20 minutes later, after explanations and promises and a few tears, Emma asked the question Maggie had been dreading. "But who will read to us when you're gone?" Before Maggie could answer, Richard's voice came from the doorway. "I will." All three turned to stare at him. In the 4 months Maggie had been coming to the house, she'd never once heard Richard read to his children. "You will?" Ethan asked, skeptical. "I will. Maggie's taught me that stories are important. Maybe it's time I remembered how to tell them." That evening, as Maggie prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the door, something else that had never happened before. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Sarah would be proud. Thank you for everything. I know you're behind the scholarship, Mr. Sterling." Richard's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean." The timing was too perfect. The anonymous benefactor, the way it covered exactly what I needed. Sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways. Maggie studied his face, looking for tells, for cracks in his composed facade. But Richard Sterling had had years of practice concealing his emotions. "If it was you," she said finally. "Thank you." "If it wasn't, thank you anyway for believing I deserved the chance." As she walked down the driveway, Maggie didn't see Richard pull out his phone and dial a familiar number. "Dr. Morgan, it's Richard Sterling. Yes, she got the letter. She's suspicious, but not certain. A pause. No, she won't pursue it. She won't. She's too grateful to risk questioning good fortune. Another pause. The second phase needs to begin soon. There's something else she needs to know before she leaves for Princeton. Richard ended the call and looked up at the February stars, thinking about secrets that had been buried for 16 years, and the conversation he would need to have with Carol Thompson very soon. Some truths, he realized, were too important to remain hidden forever. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Richard Sterling was awakened by his phone, buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Carol's name appeared on the screen, and his blood ran cold. Late-night calls never brought good news. "Carol? What's wrong?" "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry to wake you, but I'm at the hospital." Maggie collapsed again, but this time, Carol's voice broke. "This time it's different. They're running tests, and the doctor wants to know about family medical history." Richard sat up fully awake. "What kind of tests?" "Blood work, genetic screening. They're asking about her father's medical background, but—" Carol's voice became barely a whisper. "I can't tell them what I don't know." Something cold settled in Richard's stomach. "What do you mean?" "Maggie's father. His name wasn't really David Thompson, that was just what I told her. What I told everyone." Richard was quiet for a long moment, pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed suddenly clicking into place. "Carol, I'm coming to the hospital. Don't say anything else until I get there." 40 minutes later, Richard found Carol in the same waiting room where he'd sat 3 months earlier, but this time her face held a desperation that went beyond worry about money or medical bills. "Tell me," he said simply. Carol looked around the empty waiting room, then spoke in a voice so low Richard had to lean forward to hear. "Maggie's father was David Sterling, your brother." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. David, his younger brother who died in a car accident 17 years ago, the brother he'd mourned and missed and never stopped loving. "That's impossible," Richard whispered. "David never mentioned he didn't know." Carol's tears came freely now. "I was working as a waitress downtown when I met him. He was so young, so full of life. We dated for 3 months, and then he was gone on that business trip and I found out I was pregnant." Richard's mind reeled. "You never told him?" "I tried to call, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I was going to tell him when he got back, but then—" Carol's voice cracked. "Then came the news about the accident. He was gone, and I was 19 and pregnant and terrified. Why didn't you contact our family? We would have helped." "With what? I was nobody, Mr. Sterling, a waitress from the wrong side of town carrying the child of a rich man's son. Who would have believed me? And even if they did, what then? Take my baby and raise her as charity?" Richard stared at Carol, seeing her clearly for the first time, not just as his housekeeper, but as the woman his brother had loved. As the mother of his brother's child. "Maggie is David's daughter," he said, the words strange in his mouth. "She's your niece." The revelation recontextualized everything. Maggie's intelligence. David had been brilliant too. Her compassion. She'd inherited the Sterling heart alongside their stubbornness. The way she'd connected so naturally with Emma and Ethan. They were cousins, family recognizing family on some instinctual level. "The medical history the doctors need," Richard said suddenly. "David had a hereditary condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's manageable if caught early, but if left untreated—" Carol went white. Could that be why she collapsed? "We need to tell them now." As they hurried toward the information desk, Richard's mind spun with implications. Maggie was family. She'd been family all along, and he'd never known. All his guilt about helping her, all his careful orchestration of scholarships and opportunities, none of it had been necessary. She'd had a right to his support simply by being David's daughter, But more than that, she'd given him back his brother's memory in a way he'd never expected. Every time she smiled, every time she showed that particular sterling determination, David lived again. The nurse directed them to a consultation room where Dr. Harrison was waiting with Maggie's test results. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Sterling, thank you for coming so quickly." Dr. Harrison's expression was serious, but not grave. "The good news is that Maggie's condition is treatable. The cardiac irregularity we found is consistent with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but because we caught it early, medication and lifestyle changes should manage it completely." Relief flooded through Richard. "She'll be okay? She'll be fine. Better than fine, actually. Knowing about this condition means we can monitor it throughout her life. Many people with this genetic variant live completely normal lives." As they walked back toward Maggie's room, Carol stopped Richard in the hallway. "What do we tell her?" Richard thought about Maggie's fierce independence, her pride, her determination to make her own way in the world. Then he thought about Emma and Ethan and how they deserved to know they had a cousin who'd been loving them all along. "We tell her the truth," he said. "All of it. She's family, Carol. She's been family from the beginning. It's time she knew." Through the room's window, they could see Maggie sitting up in bed, looking tired but alert. She turned toward the door as they approached, and for just a moment Richard saw David smile, looking back at him, his brother's daughter, his children's cousin, the missing piece of their family that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Some secrets, Richard realized, were too beautiful to keep. Maggie stared at the DNA test results spread across her hospital bed, the numbers and percentages that rewrote her entire understanding of herself. 99, 7% probability, uncle, niece, family. "David Sterling was my father," she said quietly, testing the words. Richard sat beside her bed, his eyes red-rimmed with emotion. "My brother. He would have been so proud of who you've become." Carol stood by the window, her shoulders rigid with years of carried secrets finally released. "I should have told you sooner, Maggie. I should have told both of you." "Why didn't you?" Maggie's voice held no accusation, only a tired curiosity. "Because I was 19 and scared and ashamed. Because I convinced myself it was better for everyone if I just disappeared." Carol's voice cracked. "Because by the time I realized how wrong I was, too much time had passed." Maggie looked at Richard, studying his face for signs of resemblance to her own. She found them in the shape of his hands, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was thinking hard. "Emma and Ethan are my cousins. They are. And they love you like family already." Richard leaned forward. "The way you connected with them, how naturally you understood what they needed, it makes sense now. All this time, you were helping your own niece, and you didn't even know it. All this time, you were saving your own cousins." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Maggie had been the bridge between Richard and his grief-stricken children, never knowing she was building connections that had existed in their blood all along. "The scholarship," Maggie said suddenly. "It wasn't just kindness." Richard's expression grew careful. "What do you mean? You set it up after you found out, didn't you? After Carol told you the truth." "Maggie," Carol started, but Richard held up a hand. "No, she deserves honesty." He turned back to Maggie. "I found out 3 days ago when your mother called about the medical history. The scholarship was already in place, but knowing you were David's daughter, it changed everything." "How?" "Because suddenly it wasn't charity or kindness or even repayment for what you'd done for Emma and Ethan. It was what family does for family. It was what David would have wanted for his daughter." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation that her entire life story had shifted overnight. She thought about her father, not the vague shadow Carol had constructed, but David Sterling, a real person with a real history that she could now claim as her own. "Tell me about him," she said, "about my father." Richard's face softened with memory. David was light. He made everything brighter just by being in the room. He was brilliant, but never arrogant about it, kind, but never naive. He wanted to change the world through architecture, designing buildings that would make people feel hopeful. No, he sounds wonderful. He was, and he would have loved you beyond measure. Richard paused. "Maggie, I want you to know, the help with Princeton, the job with the children, all of it stands whether you're family or not. You earned every opportunity through your own merit, but being family makes it different, yes. It makes it different because now I get to be proud of you, not just as someone who saved my children, but as my brother's daughter, as part of our family." Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway with discharge papers and a prescription that would manage Maggie's newly discovered heart condition. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Maggie realized that everything and nothing had changed. She was still herself, still the girl who loved books and dreamed of helping children and fought fiercely for the people she cared about. But now she had a history, a legacy, a place in the world that went beyond what she could build for herself. "Will you tell Emma and Ethan?" she asked as they walked toward the parking garage. "Together," Richard said. "We'll tell them together. They should hear it from both of us." As they drove through the March evening toward the Sterling mansion, toward home, Maggie realized, she thought about the strange poetry of their story. A lost girl finding her family in the very place she'd come to heal others. A grieving father discovering his brother's legacy in the child who'd given him back his own children's laughter. Sometimes, Maggie thought, the best stories were the ones that life wrote itself. The late March sun streamed through the living room windows as Emma and Ethan sat on the couch, their faces serious, with the kind of gravity only 6-year-olds could muster when told they were about to hear something important. "Maggie has something special to tell you," Richard said, settling into the chair across from them. Maggie took a deep breath, looking at these children who had been her cousins all along, who had recognized something in her that even she hadn't understood. "Remember how you guys don't have any aunts or uncles?" she began. Emma nodded solemnly. "Just Daddy." "Well, it turns out that's not exactly true. Your daddy had a brother named David, and David was my father." Ethan's brow furrowed in concentration. "So that makes you, your cousin. We're family." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Emma launched herself off the couch and into Maggie's arms. "I knew it," she declared triumphantly. "I knew you belonged with us." "How did you know?" Maggie asked, laughing despite the tears in her eyes. "Because you feel like family. You always did." Ethan joined the hug more cautiously, his analytical mind still processing. "So when you go to Princeton, you're not really leaving, you're just going to school." "That's right. Family doesn't stop being family just because of distance." Richard watched the 3 of them, his children and his niece, and felt something that had been broken inside him for 17 years finally begin to heal. David was gone, would always be gone, but his daughter was here. His spirit lived on in Maggie's kindness, her strength, her fierce love for these children who shared her blood. "There's something else," Richard said quietly. "Carol?" Carol stepped forward from where she'd been watching near the doorway, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have a confession too," she said to Emma and Ethan. "I'm Maggie's mother, which means I'm part of your family now too." "Like a grandmother?" Emma asked hopefully. "More like an aunt," Carol corrected gently, "but close enough." As the afternoon wore on, they told stories, Richard sharing memories of David, Carol talking about Maggie as a little girl, the children chattering about all the things they wanted to show Maggie at Princeton when they visited. "I have an idea," Richard said suddenly. "What if we made this official?" "What do you mean?" Maggie asked. What if Carol and I filed paperwork to make you legally my ward until you turn 18? It wouldn't change anything day to day, but it would mean that you officially have family. Medical decisions, emergency contacts, someone to sign permission slips and college forms. Maggie looked at Carol, who nodded encouragingly. It would mean you'd never have to face anything alone again, Carol said. You'd have backup, support, people who are legally obligated to care about you. I'd like that, Maggie said softly. I'd like that very much. As evening approached, and it came time for Maggie and Carol to head home, the goodbye felt different. Lighter somehow, less like leaving and more like a pause in the conversation. "Maggie!" Emma called from the doorway as they reached the car. "Yes, sweetheart. Will you still read to us tomorrow?" "Of course. What story should we start next?" Emma and Ethan exchanged glances, then grinned identically, an expression that Maggie suddenly realized she'd seen on Richard's face a dozen times. "Something with a happy ending," Ethan said. "Something where the family finds each other." "I think I know just the story," Maggie replied. As they drove away from the mansion, Carol reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. "No regrets?" she asked. Maggie looked back at the house where her uncle and cousins waited, where her future was taking shape in ways she'd never imagined possible. She thought about Princeton, about the pediatric psychology program that would help her heal other broken families, about the scholarship funded by an uncle who'd loved her before he even knew she existed. "No regrets," she said firmly, "just gratitude." Because sometimes the most beautiful stories were the ones that began with loss and ended with love. Sometimes families were made not just by blood, but by choice, by kindness, by the daily decision to show up for each other. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that the family you'd chosen was the family you'd belonged to all along. As the car turned onto Maple Street, heading toward home, Maggie smiled. Tomorrow she would return to the Sterling mansion, her uncle's house, her cousin's home, the place where she'd always belonged. Tomorrow and every day after that, until Princeton and beyond, because now she knew the truth. Family wasn't something you lost or found. Family was something you kept, forever and always, written in your heart like the most important story ever told. The end.